17th, 1993, 59-year-old millionaire Dale Ewell was flying his Beechcraft Bonanza single-engine airplane thousands of feet above Fresno, California. Dale was a handsome man with blue eyes and dark hair that was starting to turn gray. He was flying his plane from where he lived in Fresno to a small airport about 45 minutes away because he was going to meet his wife and kids at the family's beach house for Easter weekend. In the cockpit, Dale looked out at the clear blue sky and listened to the hum of the plane's engine, and suddenly any stress he might have been dealing with just kind of disappeared. Airplanes had been a huge part of Dale's life for almost 40 years, and he never felt better than when he was flying. In the 1950s, Dale had flown twin-engine turboprop planes as a member of the United States Air Force, and then after he left the military, Dale had gotten a job selling small airplanes to private pilots and California ranchers for a company owned by a man named Frank Lamb. Frank had taken Dale under his wing and taught him everything he could about the airplane industry, and Dale had turned out to be a very gifted airplane salesman. Part of Dale's skill as a salesman was that he was very charming and he felt comfortable talking to all kinds of people, but really the main reason Dale had been so successful at selling planes was because his love of being a pilot really rubbed off on people. And when he talked to potential clients about the peace and the awe he felt when he was flying, they wanted to experience the same thing. And so Dale had quickly moved up the company ladder, and when Frank had stepped away from the business 20 years earlier, Dale had taken over and become the owner and president of the company. Once Dale was in charge, he had started making a lot of money, and he invested that money really well. So in 1992, as Dale approached his 60th birthday, he was worth about $8 million, which would be over $17 million in 2023. When Dale got to be about 20 miles away from the airport where he was going, he radioed air traffic control and got clearance to make his final approach. Dale descended to an altitude of about 2,000 feet and then started the landing procedure. And when he touched down on the runway, he was already looking forward to flying again in a couple of days. But first, he was eager to spend some time relaxing with his family. Dale got into a car that he had arranged to have waiting for him at the airport, and then he drove a few miles to Pajaro Dunes, a small upscale beachfront community in Northern California. He made his way down a secluded street past large homes that looked out onto the Pacific Ocean, and then finally he pulled up to his own beach house, he parked his car, and stepped outside. His wife, Glee, and his daughter, Tiffany, were sitting on the porch waiting for him. Glee and Tiffany had driven to the beach house together the day before. Glee, who had short brown hair and a big smile, stood up and kissed her husband when he stepped onto the porch. Glee and Dale had been married for 31 years, and when they had started making a lot of money, Glee had really committed herself to community service and philanthropy. And so as a result, back in Fresno where they lived, Glee was admired as a community leader. But Glee had a past that most people in Fresno didn't know anything about. She was extremely smart and she had a talent for speaking foreign languages. And in the late 1950s, before she and Dale had gotten married, Glee's skills had landed her a job in South America as a translator for the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, which is a federal agency in the United States that specializes in foreign intelligence. Glee's children thought it was exciting that their mom had once worked for the CIA, but Glee thought about her time in South America like it was from a different life. On the porch, Glee and Dale's daughter, Tiffany, got up and hugged her dad. Then she opened the door, and they all went inside the beach house. Tiffany was 24 years old, with cropped blonde hair and a smile that was almost identical to her mother's. She was quiet and reserved around people she didn't know, and in fact, she'd been named the shyest person in class when she was in college. But Tiffany's family and her few close friends knew she was funny and sweet and a great person to talk to once she'd let her guard down. So Dale, Glee, and Tiffany spent a lot of that day just talking to each other, and their main topic of conversation was the youngest member of the family, Dana, and his new girlfriend, Monica Zent. The two had met at their dorm at Santa Clara University, which was a little over an hour from the beach house. And the next day, Dana was supposed to bring Monica out to the beach house to meet the rest of his family. The following morning, 20-year-old Dana Ewell pulled up to the front of the beach house in his gold Mercedes-Benz, and he, along with his girlfriend, Monica, got out of the car and walked towards the front door. Dana was tall and thin with dark brown hair, and this day he wore a t-shirt and jeans. But that outfit was actually kind of unusual for him. Most of the time, when Dana went anywhere, even to his college classes, he wore a tailored Armani suit, which is very fancy. Dana looked up to his father, and he really wanted to be successful like his dad was, and so he thought it was important to dress the part. Dana and Monica walked inside the beach house, and Dana right away called out for his parents. Monica looked around the large front room and listened to the sound of the ocean just outside, and she was kind of in shock. Monica's father was an FBI agent, so she had not grown up around people who had as much money as Dana and his family. So the gold Mercedes, the beachfront property, the airplanes, and the whole lifestyle the Ewells led was just all so new to her. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany came into the front room from the kitchen and said hello to Dana and Monica. Then Glee asked Monica to go on a tour of the beach house, really just so Glee could get to know her son's new girlfriend a little bit better. And later that day, while Monica was spending time with Glee and also with Tiffany, Dana and Dale went to play tennis on a court that was reserved just for residents of this small beach community. As they played, Dale talked to his son about the airplane business, but he really wanted to hear about how Dana was doing at school. Dana said classes were going great and that he really liked his girlfriend Monica, so he was excited that the family was finally getting to meet her. Dana also said that he really hoped the entire family would get to spend more time together as a whole once this semester was over. And then the two of them started talking about their favorite topic, flying. Dana said that he wanted to get into piloting helicopters, so his dad, Dale, said they should find a good place for him to take lessons that was not too far from school. They played tennis for a bit longer, and then they headed back to the beach house. Later that night, a few hours after dinner, Dale and his wife Glee were lying in bed, and they began talking about how lucky they were to have this beach house, this really nice place where the whole family could go and spend time together and just kind of be away from everything for a little while. Glee said that she knew the kids were growing up and they had their own lives and interests, but she just hoped that Dana and Tiffany would keep coming to the beach house even when they were older and had families of their own. On April 19th, the following day, Dale helped his wife and his daughter load up Glee's gray Cadillac with the suitcases and cooler of food that they had brought to the beach. Dana and Monica were going to have Easter dinner with Monica's parents, so they had already left. Once Glee's car was loaded, Dale gave his wife and his daughter a kiss and told them he'd see them when he got home. Then Dale got into his own car and drove to the airport so he could fly his plane back to Fresno. Tiffany climbed into the passenger seat of the Cadillac, and Glee got behind the wheel, and then a couple of minutes later, they began their drive back home. It would take them 3 hours to complete the drive, but they made a pit stop about halfway through and grabbed some food at a fast food restaurant called Foster's Freeze, which was Tiffany's favorite place to get a milkshake. Finally, at about 5 p.m., Glee and Tiffany pulled into the driveway of their large ranch-style house in a secluded, wealthy neighborhood in Fresno. The house had a sprawling front yard that was beautifully landscaped with huge trees and a stone fountain in the center of the yard. Glee opened the garage door and pulled the Cadillac inside. Dale's car wasn't there, but that didn't surprise her. Even though the flight Dale had made was short, Glee knew he would spend some time at the airport making sure everything was all right with his plane. Tiffany got out of the car. She was carrying her drink from Foster's Freeze. Glee went around to the back seat, grabbed the cooler, and then followed Tiffany into their house. Once they were inside, Glee stopped to put the cooler down, but Tiffany kept on walking, and she disappeared down a hallway that led to the kitchen. Then, Glee thought that she heard something fall onto the floor down the hall, so she called out to Tiffany, but Tiffany didn't call back. So Glee walked into the hallway where Tiffany had just been, and when she did, she screamed, turned around, and started running. That night, Dana sat at the dinner table with his girlfriend Monica and her parents at Monica's parents' house. They had just finished a large Easter dinner, and Dana thanked Monica's parents for letting him spend the holiday with them. Then, not long after that, Dana and Monica drove back to their college campus in Dana's car. When they got to Dana's dorm room, he called home, but nobody answered. Dana thought it was odd that they were not picking up because he figured by now his family would be back from the beach, but Monica told him that they might have gone out for Easter dinner, or maybe they had all been worn out from the trip and just went straight to bed. But the following afternoon, Dana called home again after his classes, and there still was not any answer. So Dana called his father's office. And his father's assistant said that Dale had not checked in with her that day, but she thought it was possible that maybe Dale was just taking another day off after Easter. Dana said it seemed really strange to him that his dad had not even called the office to let her know. Dana finally hung up the phone, and then he went to find Monica in her dorm room. And as soon as Monica saw him, she knew something was wrong. Dana was pacing back and forth, and he had a really worried look on his face. Monica asked what was going on, and he told her that he still couldn't get a hold of his parents or his sister. Monica stood up and walked over to him and put her hands on his shoulders and tried to get him to calm down. And she said if he was really worried, he could totally call her dad because he was an FBI agent and he would know what to do. Dana said he really was worried, so Monica did call her father and then handed the phone over to Dana. Dana thanked Monica's dad for talking with him, and then he told him what was going on with his family. And Monica's dad pretty much immediately urged Dana to just stay calm, and then he also told Dana that, he would be happy to look around on his end to see if he could learn anything about what was going on with them. Later that day, Monica's dad would call Dana back, and even though he didn't have much information, what he did know was the Ewell's Home Security Alarm Company had not gotten any indication that the alarm had gone off or that anything out of the ordinary had occurred at the house. After hearing this, Dana did feel a bit more relaxed, and Monica would say to him that, probably he just missed his family at the house when he had called. Dana figured she was right, and he told her that he would just try to get a hold of them in the morning if they still had not contacted him by then. The next day at 9 a.m., so this was April 21st, 2 days after Glee and her daughter Tiffany had gotten back to their home in Fresno, the Ewell's housekeeper walked up to their front door, unlocked it with a key that she had, and she went inside. She was surprised that the alarm didn't beep when she walked in. The family was usually gone when she was there, and they almost always set the alarm when they left. So the housekeeper called out for Glee to see if she was home, but nobody responded. Then the housekeeper walked through the foyer into the living room that had high vaulted ceilings, and she got scared. Cushions from the couch were on the floor, and pictures had been pulled off the wall. The housekeeper called out to Glee again, but still nobody responded. And so the housekeeper took a breath and tried to calm her nerves, but when she walked into the hallway that led to the kitchen, she immediately screamed and ran back through the house out the front door, and when she got out there, she just happened to see a man walking towards her, and she began screaming out at him. The man tried to figure out what was going on. He would say that he was the Ewell's neighbor and that their son, Dana, had called him that morning because Dana was worried about his parents. The housekeeper just shook her head, started to cry, and pointed to the Ewell's front door. The neighbor would go inside, and he would see the house was a total mess. Then he too stepped into the hallway, and immediately he ran to the phone and dialed 911. A few minutes after that 911 call, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet morning in the Ewell's wealthy Fresno neighborhood. Lead investigator John Souza of the Fresno County Sheriff's Department parked his car in front of the Ewell's house and stepped outside. It was a warm spring day, about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Souza was short with dark hair and a thick mustache, and it was bright out, so he had his sunglasses on. From behind his glasses, he could see that the police sirens had already attracted a crowd. People up and down the street were now standing on their lawns, just staring over at the Ewell's house, wondering what was going on. Detective Souza saw the Ewell's housekeeper and their neighbor, who had called 911, standing outside. The housekeeper was inconsolable, and the neighbor looked like he was still in shock. So Souza walked up to them and tried to calm them down and told them everything was okay now, and then at some point the neighbor told Souza what he had seen inside of the Ewell's house. Another squad car pulled up, and Deputy Chris Curtis got out. He was young and tall with light brown hair. Souza asked the neighbor and the housekeeper to please wait outside, and he told them that other officers would arrive soon to ask them more questions. Then Souza took off his sunglasses and waved Deputy Curtis over to him, and then the two of them walked into the Ewell's house together. Every room Souza and Curtis walked through inside of the house looked like it had been totally ransacked. Souza had spent his early days in law enforcement in the robbery unit, and he told Curtis that in all his time investigating robberies, he'd never seen a house in this state. It was like whoever had done this had opened and emptied virtually every cabinet and drawer and littered the floor with everything the Ewells owned. Then Sousa and Curtis walked down the hall towards the kitchen, and they found the first body. Dale was lying face down, dead in the hallway. A pool of dried blood had formed under his face, and several unopened newspapers were scattered across the floor. Sousa thought it looked like rigor mortis had already started to set in on the body. Rigor mortis is when muscles in a body stiffen after death, and so Sousa wondered if Dale had been dead for days. Sousa and Curtis walked further down the hall, they came to the kitchen, and they stopped again, because on the kitchen floor, they saw Tiffany lying face down like her father. Blood had run across the kitchen floor, and a drink had spilled nearby. Then they went back into the hall, walked into a home office, and found the third body. Glee was lying on her side, and massive amounts of blood had pooled behind her. Not long after Sousa and Curtis found Glee, the forensics team arrived and started looking for evidence on and around the bodies. And while they did that, Sousa and Curtis searched the rest of the house. The door to the main bedroom was open, and Sousa could see that the bedroom looked even more torn apart than the rest of the house. He and Curtis walked into the room and saw that every drawer of a large wooden dresser had been opened, and clothes were all over the floor. Sousa walked over to a vanity table and saw an open jewelry box that had been emptied. It seemed clear that whoever had killed the Ewells had also stolen valuable items from this jewelry box. So Sousa thought there was a chance this was just a robbery gone wrong, that the Ewells had just come home at the worst time, and when they walked in on the robbers panicked and killed them all. After doing an initial search of the house, Sousa and Curtis joined the forensics team near Dale's body. Forensics officers had found Dale's wallet nearby, but it had been cleaned out, and that supported the idea that robbery could have been the motive behind these killings. But then, forensics officers told Sousa something that he was not expecting to hear. Based on the wounds on the bodies, they believed the Ewells had been shot with a semi-automatic 9mm pistol. But there was no murder weapon, and not a single bullet casing had been left behind. And they said the weapon used, and the way in which the victims were killed, was like something they had seen in professional hits carried out by drug cartels. They also told Sousa that they found small yellow fibers on all three bodies, but they'd have to run tests on these fibers to know what they were. Sousa didn't know what to make of any of that. On the surface, nothing about the Ewells led him to believe they were mixed up in drug smuggling or some criminal enterprise, but Sousa knew enough not to rule anything out. So, as more members of his investigative team arrived, Sousa sent them out to interview the Ewells' neighbors. Then, Sousa got word from his boss that Dana Ewell was on his way to the sheriff's station with an FBI agent, and Sousa needed to go see them. At around noon, so 3 hours after the bodies had been discovered, Dana sat with his girlfriend Monica and her father, the FBI agent, in a small office in the Fresno County Sheriff's Department. Dana had called his parents' neighbor to ask him to check on the house. After the neighbor found the bodies and called 911, he had called Dana back and told Dana he needed to come home right now. But when Dana asked what was going on, the neighbor just kept saying over and over that he just needed to come home. Right after that, Dana had found Monica, and they called Monica's dad, the FBI agent. Dana said he knew something had to be really wrong, even if the neighbor wouldn't say what it was. And so using his law enforcement contacts, Monica's dad found out what had happened, and he had called ahead to the Fresno Sheriff's Department to let them know that he and Dana would be there soon. Then Dana, Monica, and her dad had flown to Fresno and headed right to the Sheriff's Department. In the office, Monica held Dana's hand tight. Dana hadn't heard all of the details, but he knew his parents and his sister were dead. Detective Sousa and Deputy Curtis walked into the office, fresh from the crime scene. Sousa told Dana right away how sorry he was about what had happened. In a quiet voice, Dana asked if there was anything he could do to help. And Sousa said, well, I know your father was a wealthy businessman. Do you know if maybe he had any enemies in the corporate world? Dana looked up in surprise, and then looked at his girlfriend, and then over at her father, and then he looked up at Sousa and said as far as he knew, his dad did not have any enemies. They talked a while longer, and anytime Dana had questions about the investigation process, he would look to Monica's dad for help. Monica's dad and Sousa both explained that it could take a while to figure out exactly what had happened. So Dana said he would stay with his uncle, who lived close by, in case the police needed anything else from him. Sousa thanked them all for coming in and said he'd be in touch soon. But the following day, Dana would reach out to Sousa, and he would tell him that he really needed to speak to the police again. And when Sousa and Dana met for the second time in that same small office at the sheriff's department, Dana said he had not been completely honest the day before because he did not want to upset his girlfriend or his girlfriend's father. Sousa was a little thrown off by this, but he said he understood, and then he asked Dana to tell him anything that might help police in their investigation. Dana told Sousa that his father, Dale, did have one enemy that he was aware of, and his name was Frank Lamb, the man who had mentored his father and who had owned the airplane business before handing it over to Dale. Detective Sousa thanked Dana for coming back in and for being honest with him. And later that day, Sousa discovered that Frank Lamb had not just walked away from his company in the 1970s and sold it to Dale. It turned out Frank had been busted in a federal drug trafficking case, and when he got sent to prison for 3 years, Dale had swooped in and taken the company out from under him. A few days after the murder, Sousa and Curtis went to meet Frank at his house. Frank, who was very soft-spoken and polite, quickly welcomed the investigators inside. Frank said he'd read about the deaths of Dale and his family, and regardless of whatever bad blood had existed between them, Frank was sad to hear about what had happened. Sousa and Curtis pressed Frank about his connection to known drug smugglers that had landed him in prison back in the 1970s. Frank said he had no connection to any drug runners and that he had nothing to do with Dale's murder. Then he smiled at Sousa and said, Dale was very selfish and a very hard guy to work with, so I wouldn't be surprised if Dale had made a lot of people angry over his career. Sousa and Curtis left Frank's house with not much more to go on than what they had arrived with. Sousa didn't necessarily trust Frank, but the idea that Frank had waited 20 years to exact some kind of revenge on Dale didn't seem right to Sousa. Still, there were details at the crime scene that made it look like the murders could have been carried out by a hitman from a drug cartel. So Sousa didn't want to totally dismiss Frank as a suspect. But later that week, Sousa and Curtis made a discovery that seemed even more bizarre than the idea that the Ewells were connected to a drug smuggling operation. They found out that Glee had once worked for the CIA. Sousa reached out to the CIA, but the CIA was not forthcoming with many details. All Sousa learned was that Glee had been a Spanish translator in South America for the CIA over 30 years earlier. So all of a sudden, Sousa and his team wondered if Glee had been the target, and if the murders were somehow retribution for something she'd been involved in during her time in the agency. And that information about Glee's past somehow got out, and the media jumped all over it. Pretty soon, there were tabloid-style stories about the murdered millionaires with possible connections to international drug cartels and the CIA. With all this media attention, the spotlight got even brighter on the Fresno Sheriff's Department, and Dana and other members of the Ewell family and some friends started to publicly question if Sousa and his team were really up to the task here. Dana got so frustrated with the lack of progress and the crazy rumors swirling around about his family that he publicly compared Sousa and Curtis to Bert and Ernie from Sesame Street, the kids show. Dana thought these two would never find the person who had killed his parents and his sister. Sousa and his team tried to block out the noise and just stay focused on their investigation. And as they continued to turn over all the evidence in front of them, they realized that despite the possible links to drug cartels and the CIA, Sousa came to believe that the case might be a lot simpler than that. The Ewells were rich, and their house had been ransacked. But all the families in their neighborhood were rich too, and no other homes had been hit. So Sousa wanted to focus on people who would have known how wealthy the Ewells were and who had a direct connection to them. But when Sousa and his team shifted their investigation in this direction, it became clear that anyone who went to school with Dana would have known about his family's money. Because not only did Dana walk around campus in expensive Armani suits, but his college newspaper had also done a story about him. And in that story, Dana had talked a lot about the success of his father's business and his family's wealth. So Souza and his team reached out to some of Dana's friends at Santa Clara University, and a few of them said there was one person who police really needed to talk to, a recent graduate named Joel Radovich. They all said Joel was a loner and kind of a strange guy, and that he had always seemed a little obsessed with Dana. On May 8th, almost 3 weeks after the murders, Souza drove 2.5 hours from Fresno to Santa Clara to meet Joel Radovich. And when Souza had talked to Joel on the phone to arrange this meeting, he just got an odd feeling about him. Joel said he did not want police to come to his mother's house, so he would go to the motel where Souza was going to be staying. But that wasn't really what had grabbed Souza's attention. Before Souza had hung up, Joel asked him if he was going to be arrested. Souza had told Joel that, no, I really just want to talk to you, but Souza did think it was very odd that someone would jump to the conclusion that they were being arrested right off the bat. Outside the motel, Souza saw Joel pull into the parking lot in his black Honda CRX car. Joel got out of the car and began walking over to Souza. Joel was 22 years old with bleached blonde hair. He wore a baggy long-sleeve shirt and baggy jeans. Souza introduced himself and then led Joel to a small motel room, and then they both sat down at a table that was pushed up against the wall. And before Souza could even ask a question, Joel asked again if he was going to be arrested. A look of surprise came across Souza's face, and he asked why Joel was so worried about that. Joel said that he'd actually been arrested years earlier for stealing furniture from a dorm at Santa Clara University. And since then, he said the Santa Clara police were always harassing him. Souza told Joel that he didn't have anything to do with the Santa Clara police or the stolen furniture. But Souza made a note that Joel had just admitted to having committed a robbery in the past. Souza asked Joel how he knew Dana. Joel said they had met in the dorm and hung out a few times, but that was really it. Joel was a couple of years ahead of Dana in college, so they weren't really close, and Joel said he had not kept in touch with Dana, or really anybody from school, since he had graduated a year earlier. Then Souza asked Joel where he had been on Easter Sunday. Joel immediately looked up at the ceiling like he was trying to remember something, and then he looked down and he said that he'd actually been at a paint and body shop getting some work done on his car. After chatting for a bit longer, Souza finally smiled and thanked Joel for driving all this way out to the motel to meet him, and then Joel got up and walked out of the motel. But right after Joel was gone, Souza got in touch with members of his team. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he thought Joel was hiding something. He wasn't sure the kid was a killer, but he was almost positive Joel knew more than he was saying. So Souza wanted to learn as much about him as he could. It would take months for the sheriff's department to get everything in place, but eventually they got clearance to conduct full-time surveillance on Joel. And what police learned from that surveillance operation and from digging deeper into Joel's life convinced Souza the investigation was on the right track. But Souza's process was methodical and slow, and months went by without any new information getting out to the public. So Dana and other people on the outside thought the cops just weren't doing anything. And as the investigation stretched into months and then years, even Monica's dad, the FBI agent, questioned the Fresno Sheriff's Department's techniques. But Souza, Curtis, and the rest of the team just kept blocking out the public attacks. They were confident they had the killer in their sights, but they wanted to make sure their case was airtight before they moved in. In early March of 1995, almost 3 years after the murders, Souza, Curtis, and local police officers approached a TGI Fridays restaurant in a town just outside of Los Angeles. Souza went around back to where he had a car waiting, and Curtis and the others headed inside. The music was loud inside, and the place was packed, and Curtis was surprised this was where the investigation had finally led. But he and Souza were sure that the bartender working at Fridays that night was the one person who could bring the Yule murder case to a close. Curtis weaved around a few tables and moved out of the way of the server, but he never took his eyes off the bartender. And the bartender eventually looked up and saw Curtis coming his way. The bartender immediately began scanning around the room like he was looking for his exit, but he could tell there was just no way he could make a run for it. So Curtis and the other cops walked up to the bartender and told him they needed to talk. The bartender got a look on his face like he knew he'd been caught. Then police led him out through the kitchen to a parking lot behind the restaurant, and they put him in the car where Souza was waiting for him. And when Souza was done talking to this bartender, police would finally know who had killed Dale, Glee, and Tiffany, and how they had done it. Based on information provided by the bartender, evidence found at the murder scene, and details from interviews carried out during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the day someone murdered the Ewell family on April 19, 1992. On the night of April 18th, so the day before the murders, the killer watched steam rise from their shower. While the hot water ran, the killer stepped into the shower and covered their body in shaving cream. Then they reached down with their right hand, grabbed a disposable razor from the side of the shower, and ran the blade over the hair on their left forearm. A few minutes later, they rinsed the razor off under the hot water, they bent down, and started shaving the hair on their left leg. The process took a long time, but eventually the killer had removed all of their body hair except for their eyebrows and the hair on their head. After they were done, they stepped out of the shower and dried off. Before sunrise on April 19th, the following morning, the killer got dressed in all black, wore a knit hat to cover the hair on their head, and slipped on a pair of latex gloves. The killer walked outside and put a large backpack as well as an unloaded semi-automatic 9mm gun in the back seat of the car. Then the killer drove to the Ewell's neighborhood. When they arrived, they drove past the Ewell's house and parked their car a few blocks away. They grabbed the backpack and the gun, got out of the car, closed the door, and moved quickly through the darkness to the Ewell's house. Once the killer got there, they walked around to the backyard that was surrounded by a low cinder block fence. They dropped their bag and the gun into the backyard, and then climbed over the fence, they grabbed their things, and then ran to a small shed in the backyard and stepped inside. The killer had studied everything about the house, and they knew there was a spare key on the floor of the shed. So they pulled a flashlight out of their bag, they found the key, they grabbed it, and then darted across the yard towards the back door. The killer unlocked the door and walked inside. The house was dark, but the killer found their way to Dale and Glee's bedroom. They turned on the light, opened their backpack, and pulled out a large plastic sheet and unrolled the sheet across the floor. Then the killer put their gun down on the plastic sheet, they walked across the room to a jewelry box, they emptied it and put the stolen jewelry in their backpack. The killer then sat down on the plastic sheet, they reached into their backpack again and pulled out ammunition as well as a homemade silencer made with PVC pipe and several tennis balls that had been cut in half. The killer loaded their gun and attached the homemade silencer to it. Then they sat there on the plastic sheet and waited patiently for someone to come home. Several hours later, at about 5 p.m., the killer heard the garage door open. The killer felt butterflies in their stomach and a jolt of nervous energy. They grabbed their gun, they ran down the hall, and crouched down in a room that was across from the kitchen. The killer could hear a door open and then also Glee and Tiffany talking. The killer tried to control their breath and told themselves to stay calm and just wait for the right moment. Then, Tiffany walked past the killer in the hall and went into the kitchen. The killer immediately sprung up from their hiding spot, walked down the hall after her, and then pointed the gun into the kitchen and fired. The bullet hit Tiffany in the back of the head. Tiffany's drink flew from her hand, blood splashed onto the walls and floor, and she fell face down. Tiffany had died almost instantly. The killer heard Glee say something from another room, so they spun around in the hall. Then Glee came around the corner and saw the killer. Glee screamed, she turned, and started to run away, but the killer fired off 3 shots in her direction, and Glee stumbled into the office nearby. The killer ran down the hall to the office and saw Glee lying on her side and bleeding, but she was still breathing, so the killer aimed and shot Glee just below the eye. The killer was breathing fast now. They walked away from Glee's body and went to hide in the room near the kitchen, where they tried to calm down and got ready to wait some more. About 30 minutes later, the killer heard the garage door open again. The sound of the door had made them tense up, and so they stood and raised their gun and got ready for the next killing. The killer heard Dale walk into the house, and then when Dale walked down that hallway right past the killer stepped out of their hiding place, raised their gun, and shot Dale in the back of the neck. Dale immediately crumpled to the floor, and newspapers he'd picked up from the front yard scattered all around him. Dale died in the hallway before ever seeing the bodies of his wife and daughter. The killer walked forward, kneeled down, and got a close look at Dale to make sure he really was dead. Satisfied, the killer grabbed Dale's wallet out of his pants pocket, slipped Dale's cash and credit cards into their own pockets, and then dropped the wallet back on the floor. Then the killer rushed through the house, emptying drawers and cabinets, knocking stuff off of tables, and trying to make the scene look like a random burglary as much as possible. Then the killer ran to the main bedroom, rolled up their plastic sheet, and put it in their backpack. Then they walked out of the house through the backyard, put the key back where they had found it in the shed, and climbed over the fence away from the property. The killer did their best to move fast through the neighborhood without drawing any attention to themselves. They made it back to their car, they hopped in, and they sped away. A few minutes later, they pulled onto the highway and left Fresno behind. When they finally made it home, they sat down in their bed and waited for the phone to ring, because they knew Dana Ewell would be in touch soon. Joel Radovich, the young man Souza had never trusted, murdered Dale, Glee, and Tiffany. But Joel had carried these murders out at Dana Ewell's request. It would turn out that despite what Joel had told Souza, he and Dana were close friends. In fact, some people said they were almost inseparable. And according to some of their classmates, Dana and Joel seemed to lack any sense of morality. They had convinced themselves there was no difference between right and wrong, and so any action, even murder, could be justified. And Dana wanted to murder his parents and his sister because with all of them gone, he would inherit $8 million and his father's company. Dana didn't just want to follow in his father's footsteps, he wanted to replace his father. In fact, in the story Dana's college newspaper had written about him, Dana claimed to be the brains behind his father's successful airplane business, and he even implied he was running the company while going to college. So Dana had offered Joel $4 million of the inheritance he was sure to get if Joel would kill his family. Dana had given Joel a layout of the house and said he would leave a key in the shed for him and told him how to disable the alarm system. Joel had accepted the deal. Then he bought a book called Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors, to help him plan the perfect murders. The book had led Joel to shave off all of his body hair so he wouldn't leave any hair behind at the crime scene, which could then be used as DNA evidence. And the book suggested using a gun and a homemade silencer that could not be traced back to the shooter. But Joel needed help with that part of the plan, so he had turned to his good friend, the TGI Fridays bartender, who was an avid gun collector. The bartender had given Joel a semi-automatic 9mm, and he had helped Joel build the silencer. The tennis balls used in the silencer had left these strange yellow fibers on all the bodies. Then, after the murders, the bartender got the gun back, broke it apart, and buried the pieces in different places. And while that was all happening, Dana Ewell had called his father's office, and he had talked to his girlfriend's FBI agent father, all to throw off suspicion and to make people believe he, the son, was truly worried about his family and wanted justice for them. And Dana's tactics had worked for a little while, because it turned out that Souza was almost positive Joel Radovich had murdered the Ewells not long after they had met in the motel. But it took some serious digging before the investigators became convinced that Dana Ewell was the person behind his family's murder. And putting all the pieces together and getting an airtight case against Dana took a long time. But finally, surveillance on Joel had led police to the TGI Fridays bartender, and after they cornered him at work, the bartender told police he knew everything about the murders and he admitted his part in them. Then he led police to the place where he had buried the barrel of the gun that was used in the murders, and he agreed to testify against Joel and Dana in court. The bartender was ultimately granted immunity for his testimony, and as of 2023, he works as an attorney in California. As for Joel and Dana, they were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany are all buried next to each other in Fresno. The epitaph on all three of their headstones reads, "Together Forever."
In 2012, 35-year-old Jose Alvarenga was an extremely experienced fisherman, having spent years and years commercially fishing. In November of that year, Jose volunteered to do a 30-hour deep-sea fishing shift for his company off the coast of his hometown in Mexico. He hoped he'd be able to catch some sharks, marlins, and sailfish, three of the more lucrative fish you can catch. Unfortunately, the guy Jose usually went deep-sea fishing with was not able to go at the last minute, but Jose still really wanted to go out and do this shift, and so he took the only other fisherman in their company that was willing to go or that could go, and it was a 23-year-old, extremely inexperienced, brand new fisherman named Ezekiel Cordoba. And while Jose knew he was not going to be a huge asset out on the seas, he figured, it's a short trip and we're not that far off from shore, so you know what, he's fine, I'll take him. On November 17th, the pair set out on their 24-foot fiberglass skiff with a small motor. On board were various fishing tools, a radio, and a large icebox to hold all the fish they were going to catch. Once they reached the area they were going to be fishing, their trip immediately started paying off, and within just a couple of hours, they had already almost completely overloaded the icebox. Their luck was so good that when they saw a storm coming in, they decided to wait and continue to catch as many fish as they possibly could before heading in at the very last minute. But the storm that was rolling in was like the storm of the century, and by the time they did turn around to head into shore, it was too late. They got caught up in this wicked storm where the rain was so intense they literally could not see to shore. They tried to use their compass and other instruments to navigate the shore, but between the winds and the waves and the fact that their boat was so heavy from the nearly 1,000 pounds of fish they'd caught, they were just really unable to get anywhere near shore. When the storm just continued to rage and they were just kind of floundering in the water, they decided they needed to dump their catch. So they dumped all 1,000 plus pounds of fish back into the water. But even then, with a more agile boat, the storm was so severe they just could not navigate effectively. And so Jose turned off the engine and told Ezekiel that their best chance here was to just wait it out. And once it was done, they would head back into shore. But that storm continued to rage for 5 days. The torrential rain never stopped, the waves were huge, the winds were awful, and before long they were getting pulled out to sea and had no idea where they were. Now, they had only planned to be out for 30 hours, so they did not have much in the way of supplies. And so after a few days, they had run out of food and they had run out of water, but luckily, because it was raining so much, they were able to drink the rainwater. But the real immediate problem they were facing is over the course of those 5 days, the storm was just battering their boat. And by the time the storm cleared, their boat was ruined. Their motor had been torn off and was just gone. Their electronics were busted and all of their fishing gear was either damaged or gone. There was enough charge in the radio for Jose to call back to his boss on the mainland and send a mayday message, but the radio died before they got a return message, so they weren't able to confirm if anybody on land was going to come looking for them. Left with minimal supplies, no radio, no motor, Jose and Ezekiel just had to hope somebody on the mainland heard their message, and they slowly began to adjust to life at sea. Jose was able to leap into the water and catch turtles, fish, seabirds, and jellyfish with his bare hands, and so that's what they ate. And then the two of them would try to catch rainwater whenever they could, but the majority of the time they had to drink their own urine and turtle blood. Despite their initial optimism that their boss had probably heard their mayday message and would be sending people out to get them, as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, they realized that probably no one was coming to find them. Now their only hope was a plane spotted them flying overhead, or perhaps they could drift into a shipping lane and a boat could spot them. But without any way of navigating their boat, they really were just leaving it up to luck. Despite their dire situation, Jose stayed really positive and he focused on catching food and catching water, and he tracked the time really diligently by tracking the phases of the moon. Ezekiel, however, just did not have a significant role on the boat because he just wasn't skilled enough, and so he found himself sitting in the boat most of the time doing a whole lot of nothing, and he fell into a deep depression. He was not accustomed to being out on the water the way Jose was. Jose had been raised on the water. He practically only ate seafood, and a lot of it he ate raw. So in a way, Jose was kind of at home, Ezekiel was not. And then by the 4th month, Ezekiel just could no longer stomach the food they were eating. He would just get sick every single time. And so he just kind of gave up and he stopped eating. And even though Jose urged him to eat and would get him food, he didn't eat it, and eventually he starved to death. Even though Ezekiel was not a huge asset in terms of helping them survive, he did provide Jose an enormous amount of comfort. It was like you had your partner in crime here. And then once he died, Jose was alone for the first time in nearly half a year, and he fell into a very dark depression. And for 6 days, he did not touch Ezekiel's body. He just sat there and stared at him and even contemplated taking his own life. But on the 7th day, he doesn't know what it was, but he had this sudden urge to want to survive. And so he gave Ezekiel a kind of makeshift funeral. He said a few words and then disposed of his body in the ocean. And then after that, Jose became laser focused on just surviving. And survive he would for another 9 months, all by himself, out in the middle of the ocean, just floating around, drinking turtle's blood and drinking his own pee. But after those 9 months, he would finally see the thing he had been dreaming about: land. He had managed to drift all the way to the Marshall Islands. So he leapt out of his boat, he swam to shore, and there was a hut right on the beach. He knocked on the hut, and a couple came to the door, and they were totally shocked to see this guy. He didn't look too good, and they couldn't even believe his story. They couldn't believe that he had survived for so long in the water. But they quickly brought him inside, they gave him some food and drink, and they contacted authorities, and he was saved. His parents and young daughter, when they found out he was alive, they were overjoyed. They, along with everybody else, believed he had perished. They had sent out a search party for them, and they'd found pieces of their boat that had broken off in the storm, and so they assumed, they must have sank. Then, in a strange turn of events, shortly after he got home, people began accusing him of lying about what happened. People said he looked too good to have been out on the open ocean for 14 months. He should have been emaciated, and at the very least, he should have had scurvy. But doctors would say he ate so many turtles and seabirds that he was pretty well fed. And turtles and seabirds contain a high level of vitamin C that would have protected him from scurvy. Other skeptics said it would have been impossible for his skiff to float the 6,000 miles to the Marshall Islands where he ultimately found land. But then a study done at the University of Hawaii confirmed there was a current that would have pulled him from the coast of Mexico straight into the Marshall Islands. And then lastly, Ezekiel Cordoba's family accused Jose of killing Ezekiel and eating his body for sustenance. That's the only way he was able to survive. But Ezekiel roundly rejected that and took multiple lie detector tests that proved he did not do that. Today, Jose lives in a small town in El Salvador, completely surrounded by land, and he says he doesn't go anywhere near the water.
The next story is called El Fausto.
On July 20th, 1968, a small fishing boat called El Fausto took off from their port on La Palma Island, which is part of the Canary Islands, which is a Spanish archipelago, and they took off for El Hierro, which was another island about 50 miles to the south. On board El Fausto were 3 very experienced fishermen and sailors. They were the brothers Ramon and Eliberto Hernandez, as well as their cousin Miguel Acosta. Their trip to El Hierro was uneventful. It took about 7 hours. They arrived at the port in the early evening hours, and they unloaded their cargo onto the island, which was actually explosives used in agriculture. So they unloaded all that, and then the 3 of them went to get some food and relax for a few minutes before they came back to the dock and began preparing to leave. So that evening, as the 3 men are standing on their boat, repacking the ship, and getting ready to leave in the next few minutes, they see this man running down the dock who's frantically waving at them, trying to get their attention. And so they stop what they're doing and they beckon him over and say, what do you need? And the man introduced himself as Julio Garcia. He was clearly very upset. He was talking really quickly, and they had to slow him down a couple times to try to understand what he was saying. But he communicated that his wife had called him earlier that day, and she said their 2-year-old daughter was very sick and he needed to come home right away. And he ran down to catch the ferry back to his home island of La Palma, so the same island these 3 men are from, and he missed the ferry. And the next ferry going back to his home island was not for another 2 days. And so Julio was running up and down the dock trying to flag anybody who owned a ship that might be willing to take him to La Palma. Even if it was out of the way, he was prepared to pay for it. And so, of course, the El Fausto crew said, we're actually going to La Palma. We live there too, and we'd be happy to take you. You don't need to pay for this. And so Julio begins to help them load the rest of their equipment onto the boat, which included some food. They had 22 pounds of fruit, and they had some fresh water. And then once everything was loaded up, they undid their lines, and they set sail for La Palma. They took off at about 2:30 in the morning on July 21st. The water was very calm during their return trip. The only thing they had to contend with was a light mist that formed over the water in the early morning hours right after the sun came up, but it really wasn't enough to affect their ability to navigate. But even if the mist was more severe than people realized, Ramon, Eliberto, and Miguel were very experienced sailors that in fact had been sailing on this particular stretch of water ever since they were teenagers, and they had navigated these waters in far worse conditions and had always managed to get through it. But at 10 a.m. that morning, when the Fausto crew was supposed to arrive at La Palma, they didn't. And the owner of the boat itself was waiting at the dock for them, and when they didn't show up, he wasn't overly concerned because he knew these three men. He regularly went out on this particular boat with them. In fact, he normally would have gone on the trip to El Hierro with them, but he had commitments on La Palma, so he didn't go. And so he's not particularly worried about them. He figures they ran into some mechanical issue and, they're getting it figured out, but they're just late. But after a little while, the families of the El Fausto crew started to ask the owner, where are they? Why aren't they here? And so the owner, who again is not overly concerned, but wants to make sure the families are not worrying, says, you know what? I'll send a search boat that will take the exact route El Fausto was on, but in reverse. And I'm sure they can just drive straight out there and they'll run into them and they will help them fix, whatever issue they have, which is more than likely mechanical. That's an old boat, and we've certainly run into other mechanical issues in the past. So this search boat goes out, and for hours and hours and hours, they're looking along the exact same charted course that El Fausto was supposed to be on, and they're nowhere to be found. And so they radio back in to the owner of the boat, and they say, look, we can't find him. What do you want us to do? And he called them back in, and he realized that, if we can't find them anywhere near the route, that probably something more sinister has happened to them. And it was at this point that he got in touch with authorities, and they launched a much more formal search and rescue effort. Planes and boats spilled out over the sea to look for El Fausto and her crew, and everybody who was looking was operating with an enormous sense of urgency, because anybody who was looking had been told these guys don't have much in the way of supplies. They have 22 pounds of fruit, and they have a very limited freshwater supply. And so if we don't find them within a couple of days, there's a very good chance that we're going to find 4 corpses. But despite searchers' motivation to find these guys, a couple of days passed and there was no sign of them. And unfortunately, people did start to think, I think it's more likely we're going to find 4 dead bodies than 4 sailors waiting to be rescued. But on July 25th, 4 days after El Fausto left El Hierro on their way to La Palma and then, of course, got lost, 4 days after that, a British ship called Duquesa radioed in an incredible message. They said they had found this fishing boat that was drifting along, and there was 4 people standing on the deck, and they were waving flashlights around to try to get their attention. And as this British ship moved up closer to the fishing boat, they were able to read on the hull the call sign of the boat, and it was, of course, El Fausto. Where El Fausto had been found was 120 miles west of La Palma, so they had drifted way, way off course. But once they pulled up alongside of them, they could see that not only were the 4 crew members alive, they actually seemed like they were in pretty good spirits. They certainly were dehydrated and were very thankful to get some water, and they were starving, and they were obviously pretty freaked out because they had just been adrift in the middle of the ocean and probably were realizing that this could end really badly for us. But beyond all that, they seemed okay. And very quickly, that message was passed to friends and family of the El Fausto crew back on La Palma, who's waiting anxiously to hear any news about their loved ones. And when they were told they had been found and they were alive, they were overjoyed because they thought they were dead. But after the initial transmission had been sent out by Duquesa saying, hey, we found the crew and they're alive and they're good, well, a couple hours went by and the Duquesa sent another transmission that was very strange. They said the crew of El Fausto was refusing to be towed back home. They were saying that our boat's just fine, we're good, we just need a couple of supplies and we'll be on our way. And so the captain of Duquesa says to the men, then why are you out here? How did you get 120 miles west of La Palma? Something had to have gone wrong with your boat. So what happened? But the men didn't really answer his question. They just said, oh no, there's nothing wrong with our boat. There's no mechanical issues. Everything's fine. We appreciate your offer, but we just need a couple of supplies and we'll be on our way. Even Julio, who had made this special effort to get home to his sick daughter and to see his wife, even he is saying, no, we don't need a tow. We're good. And so the captain of the Duquesa is looking at these guys thinking, what am I missing here? You just drifted 120 miles away. You probably should have died. You're very lucky that we happened to find you in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Had we not found you, you probably would have died of dehydration in the next couple of days. And so we've found you. We're offering to bring you to shore to guarantee that you will get to see your sick daughter and to see your wife and for you all to see your families and your friends. And you're telling us to leave, and you're telling us that there's nothing wrong with your boat when clearly something happened. But the captain of the Duquesa could not convince them to get towed in. They were totally not going to do it. And apparently they were very polite about it. They said, look, we really appreciate the offer, but really our boat is just fine. We just need some food, water, cigarettes, and some fuel, and we'll be good. And so ultimately, the crew of the Duquesa obliged their request, and they gave them 18 hours worth of fuel along with a whole bunch of cigarettes and water and food. And they watched as the four men sailed east towards La Palma, and they were waving the whole time. Everything seemed fine. And then they vanished over the horizon. And the captain of Duquesa would call in over the radio that based on where they were and how close they were to La Palma, they should expect to see them arriving at port at about 7 p.m. that night. Back on La Palma, friends, family, and hundreds of other people from the island went down to the dock and were drinking wine and having a big party, celebrating the imminent return of their friends and their loved ones. But unfortunately, 7 p.m. came and went, and they didn't show up. And so, of course, the family of the crew became very worried that, oh my gosh, this nightmare is starting all over again. And the owner of El Fausto came over to them and reassured them that he's been in touch with the authorities who were speaking to the captain of the Duquesa, who were speaking to our friends and family and loved ones on El Fausto, and everything's fine. They have all the supplies they need. They have all the fuel they need. I'm sure they're just running a little bit late. Everything is totally fine. And so friends and family and some diehard supporters stayed down at the dock for several more hours until it became clear that something's gone wrong, and unfortunately this nightmare is not over. The next morning, after El Fausto and her crew were once again labeled missing, Spain kicked off their largest ever search for missing people. They had bombers flying overhead, they had military and civilian ships all over the area where the Duquesa had made contact with El Fausto. They had so many people combing the water, so many planes overhead, and for 2 weeks they looked everywhere and they couldn't find anything. And finally, they had to call it off. And they said, look, we don't know what happened to them. And they declared them lost at sea, which basically meant we think they're dead, but we'll probably never know for sure. 2 months later, on October 9th, an Italian merchant ship called the Anna de Mayo, who was on their way to Venezuela, spotted a small fishing boat way off in the distance that was just bobbing around aimlessly. And the first thing they noticed was this ship is far too small to be making a cross-oceanic voyage. They shouldn't be out here. And as they got closer, they could tell that there was no one standing on deck or in the cabin. There's no one driving this boat. And so finally, they got so close they could read the hull, and it says El Fausto. So the Anna de Mayo pulls up right alongside El Fausto. They tether themselves together so it doesn't float away. And two of the Italian sailors get on board El Fausto, and they're yelling out to see if anybody's there, but no one's responding. And they're looking around, and the ship is in great condition. There's no sign of obvious damage or any violence that might have taken place on here. They go into the cabin where the steering wheel is, and they're looking for some sort of logbook that would have documented, what happened on the ship, but there's no logbook. And so the Italians were left scratching their head thinking, how could a perfectly seaworthy boat wind up abandoned in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Where's their crew? But they still needed to go down below into the little space that was the engine room. And so the two sailors that had boarded to look around, they make their way over to the section of the deck where there's this hatch that they open up, and they look down and they smell this horrible smell, and they turn on their light and they're met with this horrible and inexplicable scene. Laying on the ground inside of the engine room on his back was a dead man who was partially mummified. He had no clothes on, and he was clutching a transistor radio. And so the two Italians that found him, they stepped back and they had to compose themselves. And then one of them actually went down to look around for clues and see if perhaps there's other bodies down there. And so when he went down, it was just the one body, and he could only find one other clue. And it was this small notebook that was positioned right behind the dead body that they didn't see when they first looked down. So the Italian sailors leave the engine room and they take the notebook back to their ship. And they open it up, and the first thing they see is the middle section of the notebook has been torn out. In fact, 28 pages were missing. And all they were left with was a couple of pages at the beginning and a single page at the end. The first couple of pages just were a couple of notes and some simple math calculations. Nothing significant. The last page appeared to be a farewell of sorts, but the language that was used was a little bit confusing and it was difficult to read, and so the Italians were not entirely sure what any of it actually meant. And so they figured it would be best to just give the notebook to authorities and they could figure out what it meant. And so the captain of the Ana de Mayo radios in to Spanish authorities that they've found El Fausto and that they intend to tow it back to Venezuela, where they were already going, at which point they'll turn over everything they found and authorities can take it from there. So the Italians put a tow line on the bow of El Fausto and began towing. 2 days later, Spanish authorities received a crushing telegram. Apparently the night before, as El Fausto was being towed, it suddenly lurched forward and went bow down into the water and sunk so rapidly that it ripped the tow line off of the back of the Ana de Mayo and was underwater well before they could do anything to try to stop it. The crew of the Ana de Mayo swore they had followed procedure and they knew what they were doing, and this was just kind of a freak thing, but regardless of how or why it happened, the ship was now gone, and so too was the dead bodies. They couldn't even positively identify whoever that was. All they had was that notebook they recovered from inside the engine room. The notebook was sent to La Palma, where it was put in front of the families of the 4 men who were on El Fausto, and very quickly, Julio's wife was able to identify his handwriting. He apparently had a unique way of writing, and she was used to reading it, and so she said, that's definitely his writing, and in fact, I recognize that notebook. He kept that notebook to track payments, because he was a mechanic and people requested his services, and that's what he used to track payments. This, of course, meant the dead man inside of the engine room was almost certainly Julio. Julio's wife examined the notebook, and she was able to decipher that last page, at least most of it, and she said it was this very detailed description of exactly what she needed to do once he died, because clearly, based on the way he was writing, he knew he was about to die. And at first it says, here's how you access my insurance policy, and here are the different properties I own, and how you go about selling them. And then in his final moments, he scrawled one last message at the very bottom of the last page that said, don't ever tell our son all that has happened to me. You know that God wanted this fate for me. Love you. So if Julio was so sure he was about to die that he would take the time to write out a detailed list of instructions for his wife to follow when he died, well then why didn't he take the time to also offer a small explanation as to what happened to he and the other crew members of El Fausto? He had to have known that whoever was going to find his dead body in this notebook was going to have an awful lot of questions. Unless he did know that and did write a description, except it was in those 28 pages in the middle of the notebook that had been removed. And if that's the case, then who removed them and why? And where's the rest of the El Fausto crew? And why did they tell the Duquesa that nothing was wrong with their ship? And why didn't they take the tow into shore, which would have guaranteed their safety? There's just so many questions that have never been answered in 50 years. The most widely accepted theory is the crew of El Fausto experienced a series of small but compounding setbacks that, combined with panic, led to really bad decision-making and ultimately their death. Others say there are just too many anomalies and oddities about this case to just be a product of bad decision-making, that there has to be something else going on. And so there are lots of alternative theories about what happened, ranging from abduction to illegal trafficking gone wrong, to perhaps they saw something they shouldn't have. But sadly, no one will know for sure what happened to these guys until there is a major break in the case. And at this point, people are just hoping those missing 28 pages turn up and that those will be able to explain what happened to El Fausto and her crew. The next and final story is called El Faro. On September 29th, 2015, a tropical storm named Joaquin was swirling off in the Atlantic, and forecasters were having a hard time determining how big it was going to be, how fast it was going to be, and where it was going to end up. On shore, 53-year-old Captain Michael Davidson was struggling too. He was supposed to pilot his enormous cargo ship, the El Faro, from where he was in Florida all the way out to Puerto Rico, a 2,600-mile journey that would put he and the rest of his 32-person crew directly in the path of this storm. The year before, Davidson had been passed over for a promotion for a younger, more tech-savvy captain, and so now Davidson felt like he had something to prove. As he looked out over the calm water and the clear sky, he made a fateful decision. Every agency out there was telling him to not set sail until the storm had passed. But with 37 years of experience, Davidson felt differently. He felt like he could outrun this storm. Feeling suddenly motivated and confident, Davidson boarded the El Faro, hopped on the intercom, and informed his crew that they would not be waiting out the storm. Instead, they would be sailing right by it. As El Faro cast off her lines and headed southward, the governors of New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Maryland all declared states of emergency. As the sound of El Faro's diesel engine faded over the horizon, cyclone warnings and hurricane warnings went up around the Bahamas. Schools on the islands began closing, flights were grounded, and cruise ships were diverted. Residents of one island were ordered to evacuate, and on another, police forcibly removed every occupant on this island as floodwater rose. But the first few hours of El Faro's journey were totally uneventful. But as they got closer and closer to the storm, the wind picked up and the waves grew dramatically. By nightfall, the ship was rocking so aggressively side to side that it made sleep almost impossible. By the following morning, the rain was so intense the visibility was basically zero, and the waves were now so massive that none of the crew dared go out on the deck in fear of being swept overboard. The ship's navigator told Captain Davidson that he thought this storm was a lot worse than they were expecting, and that they should really consider turning around before it was too late. Davidson and the navigator were not the only ones up on the bridge, which is where the ship is actually steered from. There was also a black box that was anchored up on the wall behind them that recorded all of the conversations that happened up there. And the black box would record increasingly anxious conversations between the crew and Davidson as they voiced their concerns about the storm. But Davidson was totally unfazed. He was adamant that the storm was not going to get any worse than what they were seeing right then and there. And even if it did get worse, they were never going to be actually in the storm's eye, and so they weren't in any real danger. But to reassure his crew, he ordered his navigator to make a slight right so everybody on board saw they were taking a wider berth around the storm. One of the crew members, a 34-year-old woman named Danielle Randolph, was not reassured by this slight right. She was a hard worker from a military family and always followed orders, but she just could not understand why Davidson was not taking the storm seriously. And so that evening, after the sun had set, Danielle very carefully stumbled her way up the stairs to the navigational bridge because the ship is still rocking violently side to side. And when she got up there, she thought she would just check the weather for herself. The black box anchored to the wall recorded her discovery. The El Faro was not going to sidestep the storm. It was sailing directly into it. You can hear the fear and surprise as Danielle turns to Davidson and says, "We're sailing right through the eye." There was a silence on the recording as Davidson must have looked down at the computer screen that Danielle had pulled up to show him the storm and their course that was going right into it. And Davidson, after he realized his mistake, has this very eerily calm tone where he says to the navigator, "Okay, I need you to make another slight right." And he assured everybody on the bridge that that would be enough, that would fix this mistake. But Danielle was not buying it. And so as professionally and respectfully as she could, she says to her captain, "This is a really bad idea. We really need to turn around right now. It's getting to the point where it's going to be too late and we won't be able to turn around." But Davidson wasn't having it. And so he told Danielle and the navigator and the other people on the bridge that they were not in danger, that everything's just fine. This is just like the storms he had been through when he used to work in Alaska, and they would get through this one too. Davidson was so confident in his decision-making that he told them he was going to go take a nap downstairs, and if they really needed him, if something serious happened, go and get him. And with that, he left the bridge and went down to his room. As the minutes of the night ticked by, Danielle stayed up in the bridge, and she braced herself against a steel girder and looked out the window at the rain that was just slashing across the window and the waves that were the size of 3-story houses crashing in on either side of them. And then by the morning, when the sun came up, the sky just stayed totally black because they were right outside the eye of the storm. Suddenly, under their feet, Danielle and the navigator and the other people up on the bridge heard this awful clanging metal sound as the constant rocking of the ship had finally loosened up the straps, holding down these massive metal containers down in the cargo hold, and they were now loose, smashing into the inside of the ship. And then they heard an even worse sound, and the black box recorded it too. And that was the shrill of an alarm that meant El Faro was taking on water. Danielle left the window and ran around to the radar screen to see if there was any ships in the area that might be able to help them. But when she looked, there was no blips on the screen. All the other ships had diverted to avoid this storm. El Faro was totally alone. At the sound of the alarm, Davidson came running back up to the bridge, and you hear him on the black box, and he sounds like someone who's acting calm, but there's a tightness in his voice that he's trying to conceal the fact that he's actually probably quite scared. Because at this point, the reality was, the Alfaro was now too close to the eye of the storm, and they would be unable to escape its grasp. They were going to get pulled into the eye of this hurricane. Furious with her captain, she brushed past him without saying anything, and then very carefully made her way down the stairs to her room. And the whole time she was walking, she would have been barely able to stand, because now with those loose shipping containers down in the cargo hold, the ship would rock even farther to each side, because as soon as it tilted one way, the containers would slam into the wall, driving it even farther into the water. When she finally staggered her way down and got to her door, she would have opened it up and her whole room would have been trashed. Everything that wasn't anchored down had been tossed all over the room, all of her clothes, any furniture would have been dumped all over the room. But she didn't care about any of her stuff on the ground. She only wanted her laptop. She found it. It was on the ground. She picked it up. She put it on her desk that was bolted down. And very carefully, she opened it up and she opened her email. As the alarms are shrieking in the background and she can hear the sound of these shipping containers smashing into the inside of the cargo hold, she writes this note to her mother where she tells her the winds are really bad and it looks like they're sailing right for the center of this storm. And she's about to hit send when she stops for a second. She looks at her computer screen and she adds one more line. Love to everyone. Danielle never said things like this. She was always strictly business. And so for her to put that line was an acknowledgement that this might be the last time she ever talks to her family. Shortly after Danielle hit send on that email, the ship listed hard to one side and then it stayed there. The loose containers down in the cargo hold had finally shifted the ship's center of gravity. Water immediately began pouring into the lower sections of Alfaro. Danielle knew it was only a matter of time before the water reached her, and so she leapt out of her room and ran down the hall, which was now sideways. She got to the stairwell and climbed her way up to the bridge. As soon as she got up there, all the people on the bridge were holding onto the center console so they didn't fall up against the wall, and she heard Davidson ordering the navigator to turn the ship into the wind. It was a last-ditch Hail Mary effort where Davidson believed the wind was so strong it would blow the ship back upright. If this didn't work, the ship was going to sink. And so the navigator began desperately turning the wheel, the lights inside of the bridge began to flicker, and the engines growled and vibrated as it churned, trying desperately to get up and over this enormous wave. But as they were just about to crest the top, the engines completely died and it went silent in the bridge. And so now that Alfaro is without power, it's just sitting idle in the middle of the storm, and it's getting smashed by these 3-story high waves, and it begins to force the nose of this giant ship to go under and stay under. Davidson breaks the silence by hitting the emergency beacon that notifies the Coast Guard, and then he screams to everybody on the bridge to go downstairs and wake everyone up. We have to get off this ship. On the black box, a new sound is heard, the abandoned ship alarm. At this point, the black box faintly picks up Davidson screaming from somewhere outside of the bridge for people to get in the rafts, get off the boat, get in the water. By this point, the back of the Alfaro would have been off the water, and the nose would have been almost pointed straight down. And so Davidson is heard coming back up into the bridge, but at this point, the bridge is sideways. It's looking straight down at the water. And it's clear there is another crew member that is stuck inside of the bridge, and he's yelling out to Davidson, Cap, you gotta help me. And Davidson is trying to find him, and he's yelling for him to come to him. And the man tells him he's stuck, he can't go anywhere, he's a goner. And Davidson, with the final words uttered on this black box, would yell to this man, I'm not leaving you, it's time to come this way. And then the black box would cut out because the black box was now underwater. For 3 days, searchers could not even get close to the Alfaro wreckage because of the storm. But when they did finally get there, all they could find were 3 life rings, 2 life rafts, and the starboard lifeboat that had been crushed on both sides. A Coast Guard helicopter found a body floating around some of this wreckage, but when they went down to retrieve it, it slipped under the water. 5 days after Alfaro's last frantic plea for help, the Coast Guard declared the ship had